I'm certain that in the history of our church, this gospel has been used any number of times to encourage people to put a little more money in the basket, get a little more sacrificial in their giving. And on Sunday when we exchange pulpits between sharing parishes, that might not be a bad idea. But I think it's also important to realize that this gospel is certainly not about what Jesus taught with Sunday collections. And it's not even just about the piety and the faith of this one particular person, the widow, that Jesus singles out. The first reading about the widow who helps the prophet is certainly an indication that there is, in this gospel story, a certain spirituality and a certain trust in God that needs to be a part of the life of anyone who's a part of the faith community. Like the widow in the first reading, this widow places her trust and her confidence in God and gives what she has in order to show some sort of gratitude to God for what she's received. In the first reading, the woman about to die has nothing left except a little bit of flour and some oil, is willing to trust the word of the prophet. And in fact, because of her trust and her confidence in God's word, she becomes a part of the solution to the nation's problems. And she becomes a part, a sign and a symbol of God's undying fidelity to his covenant, notwithstanding the sins of kings and priests and people. But today's gospel is not just one more example of what Jesus said or what Jesus did. Because this is, in fact, the last Gospel of St. Mark, the last passage from the Gospel that we're going to hear in this liturgical year. In a couple of weeks, we'll celebrate the Feast of Christ the King, the final Sunday of the years of the Church's year of grace and celebration. And next Sunday, as every year, we'll have St. Mark's presentation of something that Jesus seems to have said toward the end of his ministry about judgment and about fulfillment and about coming in glory. So today represents the last passage that we will hear as a worshiping faith community that has followed Jesus' ministry in the mind, according to the mind and the heart of St. Mark. The gospel comes from the final days of Jesus' life. Palm Sunday is already history, and Jesus is only days away from his arrest and trial, his death, and his resurrection. And many times in those final verses of St. Mark's gospel, what we find is not so much more detail about what Jesus did or said, but rather an invitation to the readers of the gospel to enter into the experience of Jesus and his community of disciples in those final days of ministry. That what St. Mark describes in the final days of Jesus' life is not so much setting the stage for the conflicts that will lead to trial and condemnation, but rather an invitation to the readers, as they were an invitation to the disciples themselves, to understand something about the life and the ministry of Jesus and the necessity for the unfolding of God's will in his death and resurrection. What Jesus says in today's gospel is as much a part of the formation of the Christian faith community as it is a description of the religious realities of his time and place. Beware of scribes who go around in long robes and accept greetings in the marketplaces. Beware of those people who seek the honor in synagogues and at banquets. Because as righteous as they may seem, as perfect as they would present themselves, as much as they know about the law and the prophets and the rules and the regulations, they will receive a very severe condemnation. Because unlike the widow who comes up to the temple treasury and offers a few small coins, scribes and Pharisees and leaders of the people had confused religion and faith with their own shortcomings, their own weaknesses, their own fears, and they found in religion a way to build themselves up in their own eyes and in the eyes of other people. And the religion that they knew so well, the tradition that they could quote, the rules and the regulations that they imposed on so many people were really just ways for them to try to prove how really perfect they were and how awful everyone else seemed to be. Scribes and Pharisees will receive a very severe condemnation, and yet a poor widow who has nothing to contribute, who probably can't read the law and the prophets, a poor widow who has no place at banquets and certainly is never invited to the front seats of the synagogues. This woman has given more than all the others combined. Because she, like the widow in the first reading, was open to the presence of God in her life, was open to the grace of God, and had confidence that even in her need she was not alone in her struggles, and that God could indeed be at the very center of her life. And she realized implicitly at some level that the confidence and the faith that she had was itself a gift from a wider faith community. And she makes her small contribution to the temple treasury, knowing that she has an obligation to give from what she has received, to maintain her membership, her partnership with other people. While for the scribes and Pharisees, religion and faith and contributions of great sums was all about making sure that everyone knew how important they were. For the widow, the small donation is a way of confessing before God her relationship with other people and her gratitude for what they had received. Like the disciples who are about to confront the scandal of Jesus' condemnation and death, this widow opens a path for understanding that in order to be disciples of Jesus Christ, in order to journey with Him toward the glory of God's kingdom, it is necessary to recognize who we are before a loving Creator God and return in whatever way we can something for the gift we have received. And in fact, the only way that we can truly express gratitude toward God is by reaching out and recognizing the needs of those around us. Scribes and Pharisees figured that one more sermon and one more explanation of the law was fulfilling some sort of an obligation for the learning they had received. The widow realizes that by contributing to the faith community, symbolically with money and most effectively with her life, she could become a part of the unfolding of God's plan for all of creation. The disciples are challenged in today's gospel to recognize who they are before a God who gives such tremendous gifts and who they are meant to be in relationship to one another. That Jesus, who seats himself before the treasury, is not just one more teacher of the law, but rather a prophet who invites rich and poor alike to a fundamental confidence in God's presence in their lives, and invites them to a recognition that all they have received is meant to set the stage for all they have yet to give. The widow, from the little bit that she has from her poverty, has contributed all that she had, her whole livelihood, says that Jesus, who is about to lay down his life, is a gift for many. The Jesus described in today's second reading from Hebrews as being the one who entered once and for all into the temple of God's glory, one who laid down his life, not like the priests of the temple worship, who year after year repeated the rituals and the words, but the Jesus who gives himself totally to the will of his Father, who lays down his life for the sake of others, is the Jesus who praises the widow who in poverty offers what she has to others, so that indeed they too might come to an experience of God's love, God's protection, God's grace. I think this gospel story on a Sunday like this, when we have an exchange of pulpits and when we reflect on the long relationship of sharing between our parishes, and I think reflect too on the program of sharing throughout the Archdiocese, that it had such a positive impact on the life of the local church. I think we too have an invitation to appreciate the fact that the call to discipleship, which has been given to each of us in baptism and sacramental formation, the call to discipleship, which is at the heart of our even bothering to come together Sunday after Sunday for worship, is not merely a matter of me and my God, of my perfection, my instruction, or what other people might think of me, but rather as disciples of the one who gave his life, disciples of the one who embraced the poverty of will. We are invited to share with others the gifts that we have received, to be the stewards of God's grace and God's gifts in the way that we relate to one another, not just in a particular small environment of our own families or our own parish, but in the context of a much wider faith community, which is our diocese, which is our church, which is our world. We are called to be disciples of Jesus Christ each and every time. We are challenged to get beyond the selfish concerns of every day of the scribes and the Pharisees and every other human person who born into this world with human weakness. Every time we're challenged to go beyond those limits, we enter into the realm of creating the kingdom of our God in this world. When we begin to recognize in the needs and the realities of others, opportunities for sharing our faith, our confidence, our hope, our questions, our desires, sometimes our disappointments and our fears. But every time we relate to another person in love and concern, we become the disciples, offering something real in return to our God for all that we have received. We are called to be disciples of Jesus Christ, and I think challenged in the final days of Jesus' life to recognize that as we move toward the reading of the Gospels of Passion, Death, and Resurrection, we are disciples who are invited to open our eyes to an understanding that the Jesus who entered into glory through his sacrifice was a Jesus who shaped and formed a community of disciples who only with great difficulty got beyond the attitudes of scribes and Pharisees and finally opened themselves to a grace of God which told them that discipleship is not about me, but rather about stewardship of us and who we are and who our God dreams us to be. We are disciples who journey toward the coming of the kingdom of our God, and disciples who, like the widow, are challenged to contribute all that we have, our whole life, because the Jesus we follow